Uh, well, thank you very much, comrades. Welcome everyone that has joined us today and for this webinar. And today is the 6th of August. And so we are very happy that we are continuing to have this engagement, and that we are continuing to really try to raise this mounting voice around bringing a critical alternative to how we view our economy, we view our society, and the kind of transformation that really we need to have, especially at this particular juncture. And so we are quite happy, and we welcome all the comrades that we see here, and those ones also that are joining us on Facebook Live. And we are happy today that we have Comrade Busi Sibeko from the IEJ, which is the Institute for Economic Justice, and who is going to give us a presentation on the role of state stimulus packages or stimulus engagements around economic development. And so, and interestingly enough, we started these sessions. We still had rumors. It's no longer a rumor now. We still had rumors, and that the National Treasury was courting the IMF and all other international lending agencies. We know now that this is no longer a rumor, that they, despite all the discussions, all the voices that have come, it's almost as if nothing was said, and they have just gone ahead, and so. But it is important that we continue this kind of engagement, and also continue in a way to build from this around, beyond just webinars and seminars, but hopefully to actually guide and build to actually something that is constructive, that is gonna involve a spread to the actual masses, so that real action can be taken that can actually help us to shift the kinds of narrative and the direction that is happening within our country. And so without much further delay, because Comrade Busi has to leave at 5:30, so let's give over to her, and then she will give us the presentation. Welcome, Busi.
Thank you for having me. I hope I can share my screen. I know we didn't test this. Hopefully you can give me, but while we set that up, yeah. Is it set? Okay.
Yeah, it's done now, yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for having me. My name is Busi Sibeko, and I'm a researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice. And I'm hoping to really speak to you today about the role of stimulatory state spending, as the flyer for the event indicates. And in our paper that we are actually putting up online today, which is co-authored by myself and Gillard Isaacs, we begin to explore this issue of a stimulatory state prior to COVID-19. And so to contextualize that by saying that this paper was not really written for the COVID moment, but is very applicable now. And because we really present ways, particularly to think around thinking about stimulatory spending and what that would do for our economy. But just as an introduction to say that, you know, as we know, prior to COVID-19, South Africa's economy had already began to be in recession, and therefore the current moment is likely to exacerbate the current situation. And we had already been arguing since 2014-15, and in fact, this paper is a sequel of sorts, because the first paper that I wrote was about the cost of austerity, and we'd been arguing for a long time as civil society organizations, the IEJ, Budget Justice Coalition, amongst others, that South Africa had been implementing austerity since 2014-15. And of course, Treasury has always argued that they have not been implementing austerity, but how we have continuously defined it is to say that there's been per capita cuts in spend in various departments, including health. And so it's very interesting that we find ourselves in a health pandemic where we have been declining the spend per capita of uninsured people in South Africa systematically for years. So prior to the COVID-19 moment, we had obviously had growth that was really poor, averaging 1.7% between 2011 and 2018. This year, we expect that growth will actually, or GDP rather, will contract, and some people say as much as 10%. There are many reasons why South Africa's economy was in this current moment, and I'll talk really to what the macroeconomic framework is of South Africa and why we, in a way, are where we are. And as we know, unemployment was significantly high and it's increased. We've seen the NITS data that has shown that more people have lost their jobs. We also knew that Black African women were the most vulnerable in terms of unemployment, with a rate of over 34.5%. And this was not the expanded definition. We also know that by now, 2 million women have lost their jobs out of the 3 million people who've lost their jobs. So we know that unemployment and the economic ramifications of our current state are, in fact, gendered and intersectional, and we have to analyze them in that way. We also know that majority of the population was already in poverty. And so, as we know, COVID-19 would have exacerbated that situation. But we are here, and we argued then that the government is not like a household, and continuously we hear this rhetoric now more than ever that we actually need to cut our spending to address debt. And over the last couple of years, debt servicing costs have been the fastest rising costs on the budget, and of course have displaced spend in other areas. So in fact, debt is not new. COVID-19 is not presenting a new challenge, but rather it has always been a key concern, which is why we wrote this paper to say, if you introduce a fiscal stimulus, you could grow this economy and in turn be able to pay that stimulus itself off and to reduce the debt to GDP ratio. Because as we know, debt to GDP is a ratio and a function of each other. So if you grow, then your debt to GDP ratio declines. So we said that governments are not like households, and that cutting spend.
Comrade Busi, sorry to interrupt. Are you deliberately not moving the slides? Because we can't move them on our screens.
Oh, sorry, I was on introduction. I'll move them in a bit.
Okay. No problem, sorry.
No, it's okay. So we argued that government spending is a large part of GDP, directly and indirectly. As we know, our roads, healthcare, electricity, ports, and education are the lifeblood of this economy. If you cut back on spending, the economy will shrink, which is what government is currently proposing, with cuts of 230 billion over the next 2 years. And therefore, the likely consequence will be increasing debt to GDP levels. So today, as I restructure this presentation, which would have been different if there wasn't COVID, but to really say that the stimulus argument is put simply in this term, which is to say, if we spend in short term, what we do is we boost demand, and that in the long term, this will boost supply. And so there's this quote in an upcoming op-ed that we'll be publishing as well. It says, if we want to change the economy, we have to start by changing how we spend money today. So if we think that cutting will resolve the issues, it really does not. So I want to go now to say that, and I actually want to use this beautiful quote that Elon used in his op-ed, saying that cutting spend now is sort of like saying a really sick person who needs ICU attention needs a healthy diet to get better. The person needs that ICU attention now, that emergency attention now. And so we can't implement things that South Africa could benefit from in the long run, in the short term, when all we need is that support and immediate demand support, which is the ICU, which would be stimulatory spending. But to say that generally our macroeconomic framework itself needs to be rethought. And so in our past work, we've written about a pro-employment macroeconomic framework, whereby we've shown that you need a three-pronged and interrelated approach. So on the left-hand side of the screen, it's sort of showing how all these different sectors need to be integrated. So you need to integrate the macroeconomic, sectoral, social, and labor policies in order to reform generally your macroeconomic framework. And so these things work together. Not all of them are part of the, the social policy is macroeconomic, but it can also be non-macroeconomic measures in a way. And so we need to have a coordinated effort amongst these different areas. And then we argue that in seeing this way, we need to think about, one, policies that directly spur employment where possible. And as we know in South Africa, the high unemployment rate that we have requires particular policy tools, which are not what we have been doing. And so we said that we also need to resolve the macroeconomic imbalances that retard employment. And three, advance structural transformation while supporting complementary sectoral labor and market policies. But just to say that at the heart of all of this is that we need tools that stimulate both aggregate demand and supply. But as we know in South Africa, historically, there's been a huge obsession with a stable macroeconomic framework. And within this macroeconomic framework, as we know, it has been about low inflation, it has been about fiscal discipline, and in the current state, that means austerity or fiscal consolidation, as it would usually be put. And it has been really all these stable policies or macroeconomic policies that have been put forward are all an extension of neoliberal policies, as we know. So what is the difference? And this has been an interesting conversation to be having, because I think that continuously, people who propose a stimulus are accused of wanting spend for spending's sake, which I think is a misconstruction of our argument. And also there's this idea that structural reforms are different. And in fact, it's either you have stimulus or structural reform, which is not necessarily true. I think on both sides, we all want growth. That's one thing that is common across board, is we all want economic growth and development and all those great things. But one of the things that Treasury has said, and quoting from Tito Mbowene's op-ed that says structural reforms, not spending. He says the release of telecommunications spectrum is an example of a structural reform that can enhance the ability of business to deploy new technologies, lower the cost of data for household, and act as a mechanism to allow new participants to enter the industry. And so my argument there would be to say that yes, and the and being that in a way, fiscal policy can play a very significant role in releasing that telecommunication spectrum. And therefore the state has to play a more active role in ensuring that these bottlenecks and issues are resolved by the state, and that we cannot wait for private sector to come to the show, or we cannot wait for somebody else to do it and invest in those kinds of infrastructure. In fact, we have to invest in ourselves. We need to spend in ways that enhance our economy and tackles those bottlenecks that we are experiencing. And so what we are saying is that, this is what macroeconomic policy needs to do, but then these things are mutually reinforcing. So we're not saying that no structural reform, well, except for the fiscal consolidation component, but we are saying that the states can play a very activist role in doing that labor of changing some of these policies. And so again, government's short-term spending can tackle some of these bottlenecks and structural issues in a way to enhance the economy in the long run. And so in our research, what we found about, and there's many great examples, I really encourage everyone to read this paper, of course, not just because I wrote it, but because there are a lot of great examples of countries that did implement fiscal stimulus and how that turned out, including an example from sub-Saharan Africa post the financial crisis. So a lot of the research presented in this paper is around how different countries responded post the financial crisis and how they were able to recover. And of course, as you can imagine, the countries that did implement stimulus were able to recover in ways that the others couldn't or didn't in most cases. And so that's why we are also for the stimulus argument, particularly because that's what evidence shows us is the most, is the best way forward. But one of the things that in assessing how fiscal policy has contributed to stable growth of aggregate demand, which is what we are particularly interested in, is that it shows that public investment contributes to building productive capacity and enhancing overall efficiency, and therefore that encourages private activity, not what Treasury is basically saying, which is to say that, you know, we need to remove ourselves from the situation so that private investment can come to the table. But what we are saying is that, again, it's sort of that telecommunications example. If Treasury were to invest in telecommunications infrastructure, in fact, private sector would therefore want to be utilizing this infrastructure and so forth. And so it would encourage private activity. We also found that investing in human capital formation, for example, skills, health, and livelihoods, has long-term growth enhancing economic benefits. And I think these are sort of the things that are taken for granted, because in the current context, we hear a lot about productive spending on productive areas of the budget. But in fact, when people sometimes talk about this, and the rhetoric is really not about spending more on health, and it's not more about spending more on education or making education better. It's really about how can we spend on infrastructure alone. But what the argument here is saying is that, you know, sometimes fiscal multipliers take a long time, and we know this. Fiscal multipliers sometimes take a long time for you to get the yield. And so it's important to acknowledge that some of these investments that are being made now into, you know, health, education, and livelihoods actually will have yield outcomes in the long run. So we also found that countries with greater public investment have higher levels of social cohesion, which is something that we should be concerned about in South Africa, generally from a political economy's perspective. Spending that increases incomes for lower income groups, as well as demand for goods from domestic firms, has strongest effects. And so this was very important because it's about how do people who are from lower income spend, and you'll see later on when I talk about the principles about South Africa, why we actually motivate for increase in spend or increase in social grants in particular. So we also found that taxation that was regressive did not actually yield the outcomes that the countries had actually set out to do. So if you look at China, in the Asian economies, a lot of what they tried to do in the 90s was to actually give tax breaks to corporates and the wealthy and so forth. But what they found was that it did not give them the effects that they thought it would. It did not benefit the economy in the ways that they thought it would. And so therefore, we'd argue that progressive policies, which are obviously not about giving tax breaks to the wealthiest, are the ones that are more appropriate and give better outcomes. And so those are some of the things. Indirect taxation has detrimental effects. So if Treasury were to introduce a VAT increase next year, I mean, or in February budget, it would definitely be bad for the economy. But so, the key part of this paper, and I won't go into there's a great part of the paper that talks about fiscal multipliers, and we measure the fiscal multipliers of South Africa. But I think this argument has been played out quite widely in the media, with debates between Treasury saying that the fiscal multipliers are close to zero and people saying that they're not, including the IEJ. So I won't go into that debate because I feel that we can talk about it in the questions and answers as well, but I feel that that's not the core of what this paper is. I think this paper really gives us a way to think about a stimulus that really structurally transforms our economy in a way that is equitable and changes the structure of the economy. So I think that's where we need to be moving. It's more of a solutions principles kind of approach. So we have a number of principles. We've got 10 principles. And I will go through them if I can find my notes. But the first one is that you need to target spend where there is highest impact. Achieving bang for the buck is obviously an important consideration. So we're not saying government should just spend, again, for the sake of spending. We're saying that they must spend where there is high value created as a result of that spend. A very interesting study in the United States shows that spending on children has actually higher marginal value of public funds. So spending on children's education and just care, children's care, ECD centers, things like that, actually have very high marginal values of return. But that's not how we think about the economy. And so part of this paper, what we try to do is to challenge these stereotypical ways that we think the economy booms, right? Like infrastructure spend is the typical one that is enacted as a way to make the economy grow. But as we hear here, the highest marginal value of public funds could be spending on children, and certainly in South Africa, this could be true. The second principle that we put forward is that we need to target spend where there are high growth and employment multipliers. And so this is really to say that high growth without employment is not ideal. In fact, we should be targeting sectors that aim for both. And it's two birds with one stone effect. So in the paper, we do outline some sectors based on our analysis of the input output, and I'll tell you them in if I can find them. Otherwise, I will say them later once I do find them. It's quite a long paper, so, but yeah, so there's that. And then we say the third principle is that we need to target spend where it is most likely to be spent immediately and thereby boost demand. And I think this is very important because when you read a lot of literature about how people implement fiscal stimulus, and we've said this before, is that the three elements that have been followed is go big, go early, and go household. And so this is that household component. It's the idea that if you put money in people's hands, they will spend that money. And particularly with people who are on the lower income spectrum, they spend more on the domestic economy, and therefore they're likely to spend it, quicker. They've got higher marginal propensity to consume. And so therefore it actually helps your domestic market in a more direct manner. And in fact, of course, transferring money to households it's faster in a way. And therefore you see the impacts a bit faster than other interventions rather. And we say the fourth principle is that it needs to improve the livelihoods for the most vulnerable. And so we cannot go blindly into an economic stimulus program and just spend in the ways that we've always spent. In fact, particularly in South Africa, we cannot afford to continuously reproduce some of the structural injustices that reproduce vulnerability. So in fact, we have to be mindful of how we spend this money in such a way that it helps the vulnerable groups, and to understand that a fiscal stimulus is not one impact for everyone. It's not the same impacts for everyone. And so we need to be aware of, when we spend money on a certain sector, how does that trickle down to various people who are affected by that sector in particular? We say the fifth principle is that it has to raise supply and advance structural transformation. I think this is also very, very important, is that again, stimulus is not just spending now just for the sake of spending. In fact, it should be used as a way to kickstart the change of the economy, right? And so we hear the president has said that we need to build a new economy. This is actually where we can start, right? We can begin to build that economy by spending in the ways that structurally change our economy. And so we need to move away from just structurally reforming and creating conditions that are ideal for business, but also to say that we need to raise the supply and demand and advance structural transformation in a different way. What has worked so far, what has not worked, and we need to really build that productive capacity in the long run. So of course, if we look at the industrial sectors and manufacturing sectors, right now, productive capacity is going to be very low. In fact, there's a study that's been released today that demonstrates some of these issues. So we're going to have to think about how do we rebuild productive capacity in our manufacturing sector in particular as one of the examples that we can think about. And how do we build long-term sustainability? A lot of people are talking about resilient economies. And everyone thinks that we are not going back to normal, but at the same time, there aren't many alternatives being put forward, implemented rather. There aren't many policies that are being implemented that structurally change where we are going currently. The sixth one is that we need to undo the harm caused by austerity this far. So it's not enough to say we will no longer cut the budget. It is very important that we assess what the impacts of cutting spend in various sectors has had thus far. And we have to ensure that we undo that harm. And the reason why this is also important is because we know that austerity has impacted women and vulnerable groups disproportionately more. And I think it's important that when we think about justice in particular, we think about how particular groups have been affected, again, by policies in a different way from, other people. And so it's very important that it's not just to stop austerity, but it's really to fix what is broken and what has been broken by austerity. So those are things we need to look at. Education sector, particularly cuts to infrastructure spend. So for a long time, government has been saying that infrastructure spend is a core of what they want to do. But at the same time, when you look at the trends, there's been some declines happening, at least at the 2016 and so forth. So it's very important that we make sure that we undo the structural harms that have been made. And infrastructure spend includes hospitals, includes schools, includes other sectors, social sectors, so we would say. We need to reduce inequality. Fiscal policy should be used to distribute resources equitably. And again, it's very important, if we look at the current package that has been announced, it is important that we analyze it not just in terms of like the size itself, but also look at how resources are being distributed. We know that only 41 billion ultimately in the end was allocated to social grants. But as we look at the various sectors, and it's not to say that one sector is more important than another, but it's to ensure that there is equitable allocations that ensure that people's lives and livelihoods are helped. And arguably the current emergency relief package did not do that. It did not improve livelihoods particularly, and it did not safeguard livelihoods in the current moment that we are. And so therefore it's at risk of reproducing structural inequalities in South Africa as they exist along the lines of race, gender, and along other identities. And the eighth one is that it has to be environmentally progressive. There's a great paper that one of my colleagues will be publishing soon about Eskom in particular. And I think it's very important that we think about our current system and how we are planning to move forward in terms of our energy sustainability within our country, and just generally in terms of environmental awareness. And so we need to think about how we can use this fiscal stimulus to change some of the ways that our current economy is not good for our environment and worsens climate change. The ninth one is that the social compact has to be made that protects jobs. So in the paper, we do have some examples about other countries where there was a clear collaboration between stakeholders to say, this is what we are all prepared to give or to negotiate to make the economy better. But of course, we acknowledge that there are power dimensions to social compacts. And in fact, social compacts in a way have become a buzzword that everyone wants to talk about. But I think it is important that we acknowledge that in this creating of a new economy, we're going to need to build relationships with each other that are based on equal power grounds, right? And so it's not just about stakeholder engagements for stakeholder engagement's sake, and it's not just a token of engagement, but rather a meaningful engagement about what a new economy looks like, particularly post-COVID, where we'll see a lot of jobs end, where we'll see a lot of catastrophe really, with people's incomes dropping, with people's livelihoods having been affected. And I think it'll be important that we all engage to talk about and buy in, and a meaningful buy-in about what the future of South Africa looks like. The 10th one is that we need to promote long-term economic sustainability in terms of growth and debt. Again, I feel that people who are anti-stimulus argument almost forget that we are not advocating for increasing spend and debt forever. I don't think anyone wants that for South Africa. We do want sustainable debt in the long run. We do want debt to be reduced. We don't want to have to pay so much debt at the expense of other things that we could be spending our fiscus on. So it's important that, the stimulus needs to be timely, time-bound, and well targeted. So it has to be within, we propose 3 years, and we propose at about 10% of GDP. So, which is, it's very interesting because this paper was written prior to obviously the COVID moment, and we actually said government should spend about the same amount that they're spending now for COVID. So it'd be interesting to readjust that to reflect the current moment, given everything that has happened. And very importantly, there at the end, we need monitoring and evaluation. So a fiscal stimulus program will not work if we are unable to say we've tried this, even if it's for a month and it didn't work, and we need to adapt differently. And so those are the 10 principles, which are very long, and I'm going to wrap up now. But to say that in the paper, we identify 3 areas that tackle multiple of these principles at the same time. So you don't need a program per principle, but you can have programs that tackle multiple of these principles at the same time. So increasing social grants, we already spoke about marginal values, and we've already spoken about propensity to spend, where money will be spent, and so forth. So social grants would be part of that. We also talk about the care economy, and there's a great study that we reference, particularly about South Africa, which shows how many jobs would be created if we were to build infrastructure for care. And so infrastructure for care would include, of course, hospitals, which is the typical one that we think about, but ECD centers, we think about physical infrastructure that we need to care for children, for the elderly, and for the sick, and so forth. So it says there in that particular study that many jobs could be created from this, not only the jobs to create the infrastructure, but the jobs to therefore occupy that infrastructure and deliver the care that we need in our society. And so this comes really from our institution's view on feminist economics and this idea of care and unpaid care work in particular. And so we are very interested in this idea of how do we ensure that our macroeconomic policies are aware of the care work that is undertaken within the economy, and how do we make that, integrate that into our policy proposals and so forth. The last one is obviously electricity infrastructure. And so here we tackle jobs and many other areas of the principles, but I won't go too much into that. But I know everyone is asking, but we can't afford it, which is what Cyril has said, President Cyril Ramaphosa has said, and so forth. But to say that the first thing is very important. There's a great quote from UNCTAD. It says that fiscal space cannot be identified as a predetermined level of resources in any economy. Rather, it is dependent on past and current fiscal policy choices, such as the extent of the government's spending, its savings, and the level of its debt relative to GDP. What matters most is the flow of revenue that accrues to the government over a period of time as a result of tax and expenditure changes and their subsequent impact on GDP through fiscal multipliers. While fiscal space is endogenous in this sense, it can still be materially constrained by limits to produce capacity, which can shift dynamically over time. I think it's very important that we do not think of fiscal space as a very fixed measure, and to think about how can we create fiscal space through our stimulus package in the long run. So it's not really about today, it's about how do we build this space at the same time assessing our capabilities to do so. No one is saying that we can spend trillions without acknowledging what the budget is capable of doing, but it's really to say that we have to think differently about fiscal space, which is something that continuously comes up. Maybe we can't afford everything now, but we can create a way to afford that spend in the next year or two or longer term. I think importantly, we also talk about debt in the paper, but of course that is now outdated given the various movements in debt in our country. But I think it's important to acknowledge debt as in the context of global structures. So what does it mean when globally debt is increasing for everyone? What does that look like? How do we understand debt differently? And in fact, in our upcoming work, we'll also be assessing debt as something that is very key to the discussion. And to also just say, We need to think about, taxation and progressive taxation. Wealth tax is something that has come up frequently over the last couple of weeks, more so than ever before. And so we need to push for progressive taxation, particularly as we know taxation will be changed, or the tax kind of brackets will be changed in the February 2021. So it's important that we institute progressive taxes. There are domestic resources. I think there are many economists who've been arguing this for a very long time, to say that we need to assess domestic resources to finance, everything in South Africa. And I think it's very important, because even in an IMF assessment of how wealthy countries are, they argue that South Africa is probably the 6th wealthiest net wealth country in the world. And I think it's very important that we assess those examples, and to say that in the current moment, National Treasury going to get that IMF loan has not justified why they needed to get that loan, and whether they considered other domestic resources, and why or why not they did not consider these various avenues. So I think it's very important that we think broadly in terms of economic tools, and not the traditional orthodox tools. And of course, there's always room to improve efficiency, capacity, and performance of government resources, which would obviously make implementing a stimulus package even better. But the last thing I want to talk about is public trust, because I think it's very important in this current context that we acknowledge that people see the state as predatory. And in fact, there's been so much corruption. And in the current moment, we're seeing a lot of articles around looting of COVID finances and so forth. So it's important that public trust be addressed. And the ways to address public trust would be to improve state capacity and to deal with corruption decisively. So there's a lot of emerging literature on a fiscal stimulus that reduces corruption risks, both in design and implementation phase. So it's important that the fiscal stimulus package does not assume that current infrastructure or current institutions are sufficient to execute as we expect it to be executed. So what would be important is that as we design this fiscal stimulus package, that we think about how will this money flow, and what are the ways in which we can implement new elements, or outsource it, or not outsource it, but implement it differently. So for instance, when we think about the 350 Rand now, there are many examples of how we could have implemented that in a way that is not what it has turned out to be, which has delayed many people. So it's really about thinking about how do we fix our institutions? How do we build capacity as we implement the fiscal stimulus itself? So that's the end. I'll stop here and just take questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Busi, for this presentation, and quite an interesting one. There is already, we will just start with more clarity questions. I know that there's one from Jenny, and I see also there's a hand raised by Comrade Rasikan. So let me just encourage those who are here on this platform, please use the platform to raise a hand. So for now we have, okay, so now we have three hands. We start with Jenny. I see that she has had questions on the thing, and then we go to Rasikan, then we will go to Comrade Jeremy, in that order.
Thanks, Comrade Sibeko, and thank you, Comrade Busi, for a very interesting presentation, and my apologies for arriving late this afternoon. It would help me enormously if you could unpack the details of how austerity programs have impacted and harmed working class women, both in the South African context and in the developing world, because it's an issue that comes to the surface very often, and we answer it in a generic way, and it would be useful if you could drill into that in more detail. And then your slide on the cross-cutting examples reminded me that someone recently had argued that public transport is potentially the most significant game changer if we want to really put the economy onto a recovery path and a development path. So just if you could respond to Thanks very much for your presentation. Very interesting.
Rasikan, I think you can go ahead.
Thanks very much. So thanks very much. Excellent presentation, Busi. I want to raise 4 points. And these are clarity issues as well. I think it's very important in terms of what you've raised to be putting the detail into the counterfactual as well. What do I mean by this? It's like the question that Jenny had just asked, that Pat had just asked, it was Jenny, about its impact on real people itself. And if we start doing that in a really consistent fashion, I think we'll escape out of using what I believe to be entrapping language. And what I mean by this, Busi, when you say that we all want growth, it's not the same growth that we are talking about. And we need to be very clear that we don't fall into the trap, as someone maybe told us, is our object to return profitability when profitability is measured on extended exploitation? We need to be quite clear about what it is that we actually mean about the things that we share in common and what it is that we want to do about it. So towards that end, and Gerhard would know this as well as others at IEG, we cannot then use the same language of human capital to talk about capabilities and capacities, because that's how we fall into this trap. Once you're issued with the certificate, that is human capital formed. That is not the same in terms of it being of social value or creating the type of society that we want. So I would encourage that we're quite clear about it. You know, as you raised at the end, Busi, the question about trust, I think, is quite significant, but it's a broader social issue. And the political economy does weigh heavy on how people trust and mistrust. Can I then suggest a contentious view that maybe it's not mistrust in the state, it's a mistrust in government as a part of the state. And we've not explored the progressive potential of the rest of the state working together. So those are the clarity, but I really enjoyed the presentation, and we do support the ideas, but I would really encourage us to be much more clearer about why we are not the same as National Treasury. Thank you very much.
Jeremy?
Yes, thanks very much. Yes, I'd like to join the other two in thanking Comrade Busi very much for a very useful input. The very last slide, I think it was the last slide, the elephant in the room, I think exactly puts your finger on the challenge that we've got. I think IEJ and a range of other forces now have been, I think, mounting a more successful than in the past common anti-austerity front. And I think that IEJ has really played a very useful leadership role in this matter, and lots of appreciation for that. Obviously, the Treasury's argument for austerity is basically presented as a part of the campaign against corruption. And I mean, interestingly, even COSATU's statement a few days back in response to the IMF loan was not really critical of the loan, but more expressed concern that the money would be spent corruptly. So you can see that even forces like COSATU are tending to fall into that agenda, that any money that ends up in the fiscus or in government's pockets is going to be stolen. So obviously the agenda of Treasury in taking out the loan was not that there weren't alternative sources or that we particularly needed the loan, but they want to lock us into an austerity and lock us into conditionalities. So I really agree with you identifying, as we argue for fiscal stimulus, we've also got to argue against corruption, but also think more about why there is such endemic corruption in South Africa. And for the moment, the arguments from the political side, certainly from the ANC side, tend to be endless sermons about ethical leadership through the eye of the needle, read the eye through the eye of the needle for the 100th time or whatever. And obviously we need ethical leadership and so on. And we don't often have that. Secondly, we obviously also need to deal with corruption through law, through the courts, through the criminal justice system and so forth. But we need to think more profoundly about why there is this endemic corruption. And I think it has a lot to do with the nature of the state that we've got, or of the government that we've got. Because part of the problem is that how does government spend? And from my time in government for 10 years as a deputy minister in a couple of departments, was that what I more and more discovered was that government has been restructured along neoliberal lines to be a procuring state. So in the Department of Public Works, for instance, we had plenty of architects and quantity surveyors and engineers and so on, but none of them did engineering or architecture or whatever. All they did was spend endless amounts of time putting out tenders and corruption. So I think we've got to, in order to win the argument against austerity and for fiscal stimulus, we need to think a lot more about that dimension of what kind of state we have and what do we mean by a capable state. So I'm also intrigued, and you didn't spell them out, but you did list, or you did indicate that in the broader paper, there are interesting examples about how to run fiscal stimulus in more effective and less corruptible ways. The second point I want to make is a little bit related to what the comrade just before has raised, is that I think that we should, be careful about words that we use. And I think that what we should be saying is that what we want is structural transformation and not structural reforms, which is what you were saying towards the end in any case. Because then to clearly demarcate what we're trying to achieve, amongst other things, through fiscal stimulus, it's a transformational struggle rather than just reforms. Otherwise, we quickly collapse then into their language. And I agree with, when you say we all want growth, we need to be careful about saying that. We even need to be careful about what on earth we mean by GDP. The penultimate point I want to make is I really agree strongly with the importance of childcare as being a very important area that requires and would have immediate impact in terms of the fiscal stimulus. The whole care economy, and particularly the childcare issue. There's some interesting stuff in the Washington Post recently, for instance, estimating that as a result of lockdowns and so forth, the absence of effective childcare available to those who want to go to work, it's costing the economy something like 10% of its potential growth. So even the Washington Post is saying that. But I was a little concerned that your childcare approach was to focus on infrastructure of ECDs, schools, and so on. Yes, that's important. But, you know, we also need to work with the reality of South Africa out there. So there's something like, and no one really knows, and I've tried to get figures and no one has them, but there must be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of informal creches, which is how the working class kids, when they are looked after, are being looked after in these informal creches. How do we, through fiscal stimulus, support those endeavors rather than just through trying to build a few more ECDs? And for me, that's critically linked to really reinvigorating the community works program, because I think that's a key thing. Very last point, partly responding to Jenny. Yes, I think public transport is a game changer, potential game changer, but the real problem with public transport in South Africa is the spatial design, apartheid designs, which we are locked into still. And so for me, a key fiscal stimulus and structural transformation spend would be one which begins to significantly transform particularly urban spaces, that's the only way in which we're going to also begin to transform, provide safe, effective, and reliable public transport as well. Sorry, that was a long speech, but really lots of appreciation for the input. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jeremy. Before you answer, Busi, there's just one very short question by Pat Horn, in which she was asking which countries in sub-Saharan Africa that you were mentioning that actually implemented some stimulus policies, just the examples of those countries. Let me give you Busi to answer now, and then when we come back, I will start with a question from Tumani, and then we'll see other hands as well. Busi?
No, thank you for the questions. I think the first one, I'll start with Jenny's ones around unpacking the details of working class women. So the cost austerity paper does not particularly focus on working women, I have to admit, in this particular way, but I think from other countries, so I can't tell you exactly in South Africa, because I think that type of the costs of austerity have not been measured in the same way. And in fact, the paper centralizes a lot around budget spend. And so therefore it would be education and health being the key examples that we draw on in that particular paper. But I think from the international experience, when talking about working women, it's really around women shouldering the burden of social reproductive work. And therefore, and also women being disproportionately more, utilizing social programs and so forth. And so when governments in Europe particularly were cutting some of these social programs, women were being disproportionately affected because they relied on those programs as, you know, like as of course, if you're a parent and your child goes to the an after-school program, for instance, like an after-school program that is publicly funded, and that funding is withdrawn, what does it mean for you as a working class woman to be able to take care of your child after work and so forth? So, and also I think the European experience is different because one of the evidence that they draw from is the fact that there was a man session before the 2008-9 crisis, which means a lot of men were losing their jobs, and that the financial crisis hits, and then a lot of women who are disproportionately affected in public work then lose their jobs. And so the approach in the international research is a bit different. I don't know, I can't say with certainty whether we had a man session, and you know what I mean? I tried to find details around the composition of our public sector gender composition or sex composition, and that was very difficult to come by and to analyze post-financial crisis, how many women would have lost their jobs, for instance, or men or so forth. So I think in South Africa, you raise a really important point here, particularly with South Africa, is that we still have to do an assessment. And in fact, you know, we need, in other countries, they've done a human rights assessment, you know, post-austerity and so forth. I think in South Africa, we're going to have to do that. I just don't know who would lead on that and how they would lead on that, and with, you know, what kind of capacity and funding and support and expertise would be needed to conduct that kind of, you know, assessment, which would take a lot of work. And in terms of the cross, the public transport is a great example. We only put forward 3 examples. They're not prescriptive. So I want to say that we were sort of just showcasing how government could think of, or, you know, we could think collectively of programs that would speak to a lot of these principles, and to show that it's not about a program per principal or 50 programs per principal. That's not really what we're aiming for. We're talking about, these are the sort of the big impact projects that we can do. I think the comment around is very important. I agree with the language. I think it's important. What we were saying at the time, of course, obviously this is pre-COVID as well. And I think that you know, our senses of growth and economic recovery have all, you know, in a way changed in many ways. And I think what I'm really trying to say here is that, or trying to highlight, is that how we believe, Treasury believes we can get growth and debt to GDP to decrease in a particular manner, and we think of it in a different way. And these are the ways that we are thinking about how we can recover the economy and get, you know, potentially economic growth, ideally. You know, there's no certainty that we're going to get high levels of growth post-COVID. There's something about the economy that's structurally, like, not structurally, but is changing about these prospects of growth, and we will have to grapple with these. And like I said, the paper was largely written before, and so we'd have to reassess in the current moment what we, would think about in that particular way. So to say that the growth that we would like to see has to be within those principles that change the economy in those various manners, that is equitable and ensures that, there's intersectional assessments of how fiscal stimulus impacts people, that the growth is not the status quo as we've traditionally had. And yeah, of course, think about that. And I think very interesting, the idea of public trust and the state and government. I think that's very interesting because in a lot of the feminist literature that I've been reading, there's been very interesting ideas about how people identify with the state. And I think something to explore in South Africa particularly is how do people relate to the state when they don't necessarily get resources from the state, or for instance, they don't get service delivery. You live in a place where you haven't really had that opportunity or engagement. So I think there's a lot of discussions to be had about state, government, how people relate to either or, whether they relate, which people relate and how. I think that's also a very important conversation to be had. In terms of the austerity and corruption, I think that's very important, Jeremy, because I think that has been something I've been thinking a lot about, which is how I encountered that literature around fiscal stimuli that are designed with anti-corruption strategies, because I was starting to see this, because austerity is moralized, right? So austerity is moralized in the public minds, whether it's through debt, whether they're telling us that the debt is high, that's why we have to cut the budget, and then they're equating the budget to a household budget. That's a moralization technique, right? And in the cost austerity, I write a lot about this. But in this one, in the current moment, corruption is emerging quickly as that. But also to also say that I think it's important that we also identify that cutting budgets does not decisively also resolve corruption. That's also the thing, right? It's like is the tool appropriate? And it's not to say that, we want corruption forever, but is the tool of cutting the budget appropriate for addressing corruption? And I think that's something that isn't discussed enough. I can't read my own handwriting. But I think it's very important. You mentioned GDP. I think there's a lot of conversation, of course, to be had about, I would argue with you that GDP is not the greatest measure of kind of the economy and where we are and who we are and what we're trying to do and so forth. But, there's actually no but like I agree with you, that's it. And in terms of the importance of child care, creches, and so forth, I think you'll see that in our paper, we address some of those things that you raised. I don't think that we are arguing for building new infrastructure in a sense that there's no consideration that we could be creating a creche. If someone has an informal creche, I don't think this excludes the helping of that person who has an informal creche to therefore build a formalized creche. I don't know if that makes sense, but just to say that it's very broad strokes, and we think about care as well as health care, right? Because one of the things that are about care, I know we're thinking about it through a feminist lens and about, unpaid care work, but also thinking about taking care of, people with disabilities and so forth, living with disabilities, and so different ways of thinking about that. But there was one other thing I wanted to tell you that I am now blanking on. We definitely mentioned this idea, and I don't know if it was you, but this idea that women obviously spend more of their time on unpaid work, and therefore, by virtue of that, sometimes it excludes them from the labor market. That's something that I've written explicitly about in this particular section of the paper about, if we create care infrastructure that works for women and who bear the burden, well, works for everyone, but for women particularly who bear the burden, we will change the economy itself, right? So very important there as well. Which countries in Sub-Saharan Africa? So there aren't specific countries, but it's a reference of a study where they discuss how multiple countries implemented stimulus and what the effects are. Of course, it's sort of a modeling type of paper. So reference a lot of papers that were aggregating analysis, only because one, we obviously couldn't go through every single country that's implemented fiscal stimulus to be able to justify that. But also two, I think what the value of this paper does is that it contextualizes a lot of South Africa. This is the main actor in this paper is South Africa. And so it wasn't really so much about who did what, how, but to say these are some examples, but the key person or people or key focus of our paper is South Africa, and these are the ways that we want to think differently about how to change the economy in the medium term. So the paper was also written about how do we implement a fiscal stimulus in the medium term to deal with all these issues that we're seeing pre-COVID. And so now we obviously have to take these principles and adapt them to the current moment. So it's a true test of our principles and how we can apply them in practical ways.
Okay. Thanks, Busi. There is also another round of questions. There's one from Alfred, who is asking just clarity on what is activist fiscal policy. And then there's a question from Comrade Tumani, and it reads, you mentioned that South Africa needs to reform its electricity infrastructure. What sort of energy market environment do you envisage for this sort of movement to phase in and encourage competition that is not predicated upon ESCOM endorsed projects? Do you see nuclear energy investment playing a role in increasing the resilience of our energy grid in the medium to long term? So that would be the one from Tumani. I see that also there are two hands here. Let me just allow them. We have Pat Horn, and then we have Comrade Jeremy again. So let me start with Pat Horn.
Thanks, Comrades Chair. Thanks for that presentation, Busi. It was, this is not, an area I'm very strong in, and I found your presentation, really good, because it's somebody like me could understand it, and it was really helpful because my mind is going to, how can one, as you've said, use it in the current moment, and I'm looking at it from the point of view of sitting in negotiations in NEDLAC's Rapid Response Task Team, which is a much more useful structure than we used to have in NEDLAC before for responding to current issues, and we've been able to use that for a number of current issues. And one of the issues that's kind of come in, I think by accident, because the Minister of Social Development made an announcement she wasn't really supposed to make, but kind of indicating that the Department of Social Development is looking at the issue of a universal basic income grant. And your paper certainly says the same kind of things that we've actually been hearing from this Department of Social Development. Now, it seems to me that just like the issue about the basic income grant, which for years, a whole lot of work was done on it, a whole lot of research, all of the information is there, but it didn't fly. Now, it seems that the Pandora's box has been opened and it can't be squashed back in again. So after the minister took apparently even her own department by surprise, but they explained to us it wasn't that they hadn't been discussing it. They had, but they hadn't agreed to announce it. And of course, the Treasury was furious. But the thing is, it seems it can't go back. So the question then is, taking into account all the reasons why this kind of thinking wasn't flying before, why we found ourselves at odds with Treasury all the time, what can be done now? But now that the situation is such that there's more pressure to consider things that were not considered before. So the kinds of stimuli, so your issue, even though you did this work before, the issue then is, how to now use the time that we're in at the moment to try and see what we can do about taking it somewhere. So I think the first issue that we should maybe think about as activists then is the fact that there was some pushback after the minister delivered his structural budget. And there's been ongoing discussion. I mean, as Jeremy says, the IEJ has played an enormous role in that, and it's been really helpful. It's what's made people like me start to look at these issues, you know, more deeply. So, I mean, maybe we should be looking at a campaign or a strategy, something that we need to implement quite soon, of increasing the pressure to reconsider that supplementary budget, putting in a stimulus package for now, maybe a short-term one at least, and bearing in mind your issue about there having to be short-term spending that is going to create some sort of a result. Clearly, the corruption issue has to come into that, and something more than, as Jeremy says, these ethical statements by the biggest crooks in the ANC about you know, being ethical. So, I mean, those are really unconvincing. But something that you talked about and that Jeremy also mentioned, we noticed, for example, recently in the rapid response, the place where NEDLAC started to talk about corruption just in the last week was on the issue of procurement of PPEs, and clearly that's, you know, where, you know, the one that's in the public eye at the moment. And, you know, we've been trying to get a market for home-based workers that are making masks. And the reason that we couldn't get them access to the markets, even, you know, by collaborating with the trade unionists in the sector, they were saying they can't even get access to the big factories for markets because nobody's getting access because of the procurement system. So it struck me that maybe we need to have some kind of a strategy as part of this package of focusing on when we're looking at production, focusing on dealing directly with producers and not with intermediaries. Because one of the things about procurement is it's procurement through intermediaries, people who get the tenders because of who they're related to and not because they are producers in that particular area of work. And it's certainly, when it comes to very small scale production, in this particular case we were looking at home-based workers, but there's other kind of very small scale production, including what's been done in the informal economy, that their biggest problem is not being able to get to the market because of the use of intermediaries, procurement and so on. So I just wanted to, this is not only to you, Busi, actually, to everybody in the room, you know, can we opportunistically use this, the ideas that you've come with in your paper, to have a campaign to go for the universal basic income grant? I somehow have the feeling that if we don't make a breakthrough now, we'll go back to where we were before, where we will be just as unable to make a breakthrough. So, I mean, maybe now is the time to really go for it in a big way, and then have a very, very clear strategy. Because I know that with the Treasury, it's the main issue that the Minister of Finance brings up in every meeting that he attends of NEDLAC. So even though we know that his corruption issue isn't all about this, certainly we need to have an answer on that in our strategy. So thanks very much. It was really good for, you know, prickling these thoughts, your presentation. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Comrade Pat. We have a hand up by Comrade Mfuneko Toyana. Comrade Mfuneko, please ask.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. Thank you. Just to be clear, I'm a journalist for Reuters News, and we have begun writing about the big issue. So very happy to have this kind of forum to pose some questions. What I'm wondering is, do you believe that there is enough political support for the policy? Because like people have said, it has come up in 99, 2000, it has come up during the 2010 years, but has never found enough backing. So do you think there is support? And I think it's significant that President Ramaphosa has been relatively silent about a basic income policy. And Minister Mboweni in public as well has been very silent about it. And besides the Minister of Social Development, there hasn't been any other minister who has come out in explicit support for the policy. So my key question is, do you think there is political support that will get this kind of policy over the line? And if there is, from which quarters is it coming from? Is it coming from cabinet? Is it coming from the presidency? And if that support doesn't come from those quarters, is it likely that then the policy can get over the line? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mponeko. Busi, there's one more question here. Actually, two questions from Comrade Tolika Sibiya. One is saying that how is growing the economy helpful if it doesn't tamper with control and ownership patterns? How do we tamper with ownership patterns of our economy? That's the first one. The second one, he says, I think related to the first, we want to grow the economy, to which we should, to create employment, reverse poverty levels. What about racial inequalities in all facets? Growing the economy, does growing the economy fundamentally alter, or what does it fundamentally alter? So maybe let's take those ones for now, Busi, and then we'll have one more round again.
Okay, maybe I'll just start with a comment that I'd actually forgotten. That's the part that I couldn't read from the last the last round of questions, which was brought up again in this round. And I think it's very important to acknowledge how austerity and neoliberalism, or austerity reinforces neoliberalism and this idea of a small state. And I think when we think about, and it was mentioned before, of the government as a procurement, having this procurement function, it shows you how these things reinforce that, right? Because austerity favors a small state and bears the, it sort of believes that private sector can provision a lot of these goods, which is why, the consistent rhetoric is around government spending is crowding out private sector. And that's what Treasury's been saying a lot of. And it's important that we read between those lines about what is really being said about, the role of private sector and therefore the role of government in provisioning particular goods and so forth. I think in terms of the activist fiscal policy, it's really, the term is really what kind of a new term that I made up, I guess. But it's a new term that's really about saying that the state has to play an active role in fiscal policy, and that they cannot actually just see themselves as accountants that have to balance debt. And this is where all these principles are coming from, to say that it's not just about balancing the books, it's about spending money that helps us for the future. It's about spending now that changes the structure of our economy, and that we can't just continue on the status quo that says that we're going to create these lovely conditions for private sector to come in and save us all effectively. And that's not to undermine private sector investment. Public sector has its role. And not to say that, private sector must go away. That's not what I'm saying at all, but just saying that we need to focus in and zone in on what the government should be doing. What is their role in this particular moment, and how do they change our economy? And to then link it to that question about the patterns of the economy. That's a very important question, because I think one of the things we grappled about, and that's why the understanding of government spend as intersectional is important, right? To understand that government spend does not have neutral impacts on society generally. And again, I think this could be an opportunity to think about how do we design a fiscal stimulus that ultimately, challenges, because I don't know if a medium-term stimulus package of this nature that we're proposing could really overhaul the whole thing, but we can think about how do we create a fiscal stimulus that has racial inequality at the core of it. And so you saw some of the principles about not impacting the vulnerable more, right? And not being equitable is a key element of this. And how do we design that? I don't know. We have to take these principles further. I'm going to need the help of all of you to think about these various sectors and how we apply that to sector-specific areas. How do we apply this to, child grants? How do we apply this to various sectors? I have to say that I'm not a sectoral expert. And in fact, when I work within the Budget Justice Coalition, I rely a lot on my colleagues who know these sectors very well, and that's how we engage together. So just to say and emphasize here that I think sometimes, rather a political commentary of large, to say that sometimes I think this idea of economists and knowing many things is really flawed. I know what I wrote, which is I know about short-term demand and increasing long-term supply, and how I think we should do it based on the research that I've done it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I've got all the answers, especially like the one about politics. The political buy-in would not be something that I can speak to in this capacity, because it's just simply not within my expertise, and that includes electricity infrastructure, particularly nuclear. Like I said, my colleague will be publishing a paper and she's been working on this kind of question, but unfortunately I'm unable to give an answer to that. I think in terms of the basic income grant, something that's coming up and very important, and I just want to indicate that I think there's people who are exploring research within this area that we must all look out for and engage with once it's available, because I've always said that it's important that we have to reimagine and think differently. Like big, the way we were proposing it in 2003, can't be the same thing. We can't be putting the same thing on the table. South Africa has changed a lot since 2003. And so we're going to have to reimagine, what is it that we're saying? What is it that we want? How does big fit into the picture right now? And I think we all have an idea of how we think it fits into the picture, but I think it's always important that when we do, as activists and as people who are proposing alternatives, when we do get a piece of what we've always wanted, I think it's important to reflect on the time and whether it still makes sense and whether we can imagine more and go beyond. In 2003, I wasn't an economist, so I don't even know what that kind of analysis of that time was. But I think it's important that that these new ideas come into the room, that people who are now economists who are focused on big are able to also say, look, it's 2020, and actually these are the ways that this must change to be in the current context and to transform livelihoods in the ways that we want them to be transformed. So that's all. And I think that the NEDLAC is always an interesting thing to talk about. I was thinking about NEDLAC this morning, strange enough, and how long it's been since I was there. But yeah, so thinking about even NEDLAC, like how do we think about it and how we engage these conversations within NEDLAC, including macroeconomic policy, including all these various elements is very important as well. And what participation, I think what to me has emerged over the last couple of weeks is what is meaningful participation in South Africa? And I don't think we're getting enough of that. And like you said, sometimes it's like Treasury says certain things that go against, or, they don't agree with other elements of government. And I mean, there's one clear example. So you will see that, I think Duma Gugule and I were discussing this recently, to say that we actually need to look at what is announced by the president and what Treasury delivers in a systematic way. Because we are finding inconsistencies. The president says 1.6 billion will be allocated to gender-based violence. We look at the budget, and 1.6 billion is not new money allocated towards gender-based violence. And I think it's very important that we think about that loop structure in a way, and how these institutions relate to each other to deliver, what the directive is, whether it's coming from president, whether it's coming from civil society, whoever it's coming from. How do we think about how these structures communicate with each other to deliver what's meant to be delivered?
Thanks, Busi. I see a hand by Neil Coleman. Yes, Neil? Comrade Neil?
Sorry, comrade, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Sorry, I'm having problems with my headphones. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Okay, okay. Now I was on these remote things. No, I just wanted to comment on this issue around that Busi was raising around changing conditions around the basic income grant debate. You know, Pat, I think very correctly identified the fact that we are in a particular moment now, which is quite different from the early 2000s in relation to the possibilities of introducing a big, and quite correctly, it was a bit of an eccentric intervention by the minister, which hadn't been necessarily mandated by cabinet, but I think reflects the nature of the emergency which is currently being confronted. So in the early 2000s, in the big coalition, we were talking about a replacement of the existing grants, the child support grants, and possibly the old age pension by a big. Whereas now to try to replace the entire social grant system, the child support grant and the old age pension would be a inappropriate intervention, given that could take probably years to do. Whereas what we need is an immediate a universal grant particularly for the unemployed aged 18 to 59. So in that sense, I don't think it was just the minister. I think it's progressive people within the department who've been pushing for a big for many years, who pushed this agenda. And I think that organizations need to take the cue to realize that the gap exists, as Pat was saying, to push for this very urgently, given that the COVID special grant expires at the end of October. So the question is what happens from November, and the possibility of phasing in a universal grant for 18 to 59-year-olds is a real prospect now, given the extent of the crisis. So just wanted to endorse what Busi was saying about changing conditions, as well as Pat, and to say that that I think gives us an indication as to what the strategic focus should be. There's no doubt, though, that there's going to be massive resistance from Treasury, not necessarily to the introduction of a big, in line with the international approach to a UBI, which is that you replace public services with a small grant. Some in Treasury would probably like the other grants to be replaced by a big, and at a much lower level, like the 350 Rand. So it's going to be both a contestation over the architecture as well as the amount of the grant. And so progressive forces need a very clear idea in this regard. And the IEJ has been asked to do some modeling. So we're discussing this currently, looking at modeling various options. But obviously, at a broader strategic level, to have organizations discussing whether they agree with that approach, I think would be quite important to see some sort of convergence. Because at this point, there is some fragmentation of the forces, with the unemployed, for example, arguing for an unemployed grant, which is not universal, which would really set us back, I think, because we've got to win the debate around universality, which is that all adults are entitled to the grant, regardless of their employment status. Otherwise, we've seen, as with the COVID-19 grant, that the exclusionary criteria will create utter chaos and exclusion of large portions of the population. Sorry to be long, comrades.
Thank you very much, Neil. Comrades, I just have to announce that Busi has to leave now. She has another engagement that is at past. But I think, though we can continue ourselves with this conversation, there seems to be quite an uptake on the discussion. Even I see on the chat here, on the PIG, and so maybe then we can just discuss that, because essentially the issues that were raised by Pat, and I think I saw Jenny responded on the chat there. So maybe we can just maybe have the discussion on our way towards closing the session.
No, thank you, Sembi. So I think once it's up, once the paper's up on our website, I will send it to you to distribute, but I'm going to write my email address in the chat. If anyone would like to send any particular questions or engage further once the paper is online. I do think that I tried to squish, I think the paper is like 70 pages long. So I tried to squish everything into this presentation, but I do think some of the questions might be answered in engaging with the longer document itself.
Thank you very much, Busi. And so we will look forward to the paper itself and to be able to engage it more. Is there still any hands out for more discussion, or let me just see if there are any hands here. Doesn't look like there are hands. So I suppose then I'm not sure whether then, so I suppose it might be the case that since the presenter has had to leave, probably then there is not much appetite to engage further. But this was an interesting conversation that we had. I was personally quite interested in the discussion that was going to be a possibility of PIGs. In the past seminars, one of the things that has come up, and I think that has been in the discussion, was around how are we able to mobilize beyond these kind of platforms to actually build concrete structures so that these become more than just engagements and publications, but essentially are able to galvanize active forces across the spectrum, so that they can really be much more concrete strategies that are waged to ensure that we move beyond just talk shows. I see here maybe there's a point that Jenny wants to make. So Jenny.
Thanks, Comrade Stimby. So I must say, for me, this is one of the discussions that we really do need to get into in a lot of detail. And I think the point that was raised around the extent of political will is something that we need to take very seriously, because political will is influenced by the extent to which we mobilize social forces to put forward particular perspectives and particular demands. And I do think that we have an opportunity now that we need to take with both hands. So my suggestion would be that we actually ask you to facilitate, to organize a specific session dealing with the basic income grant in detail, looking not only at the design issues, because there are issues around, are we talking about a universal basic income grant, or are we talking about an income grant that is only for people who are unemployed and not on UIF? So there are a whole lot of issues that need to take place around that. But then there's also the issue of what is the value that we're actually wanting to attach to a basic income grant? Is this a 350 kind of crisis intervention, or is this actually something that builds on the principle of a minimum guaranteed income for all adults in society? And if so, how do we deal with that? And then I think the issues that Neil was talking about of modeling come in. So that would be my suggestion, that it warrants a detailed discussion on. It's come up, I think, in practically every, if not every, seminar that we've had over the past couple of months that we've been talking in this forum. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I see also there's something Pat is saying. Comrade Pat? Pat Hahn?
Sorry, unmuting. Something else was on top of where my cursor was, so I couldn't unmute. Yeah, comrades, I think we should look specifically at the UBIG, the Universal Basic Income Grant. I think if we start looking generally at basic income grants, we won't even like come out of the clouds. I think we should look specifically, you know, as Neil has mentioned, you know, what's actually coming up now. Look specifically at that, and then the issue of you know, the amount and so on. Because I had a long chat in private with Enoch Godongwana the other day while other people were having a webinar, and we had a private chat at the end, because I mean his argument was, you know, how are we going to pay for it? And finally, and I said to him, well, why don't we start the discussion there? And that's exactly why I was interested in the stimulus discussion, because I think that's the only issue, is to put forward a proposal about how we're going to pay for it. That can fly, that we can put forward to the current Treasury, given that, you know, we're looking at the supplementary budget, given that there's some level of acceptability in different quarters of government, that even among those who think we can't afford it, that it's desirable. So I actually think that instead of starting off and looking at different basic income grants, which I think will unfocus us and divert us, we should look specifically at the UBIG. We should look at specifically at packages for different amounts. I mean, there are a couple of amounts that have been floated around. One amount that's been floated is 500 Rand a month to each individual. And then another amount has been 1.2 per month. I mean, maybe we should look at those different packages, but then look at what would the package look at as a whole, and what is the way, you know, to sell it. Because, you know, having got to that point with Godongwana, he then promised to get back to me, and we shared contact details, and I haven't heard from him since then. But that's the part of the ANC which is resisting it at the moment. So, you know, I do think that of course, you know, it's worthwhile having bigger discussions, but I think, you know, because I'm thinking of campaigns and I'm thinking of what we need to be able to have, we need weaponry to arm us in NEDLAC, because we actually managed to convince the rapid response teams to start a discussion about this. Because until last week, we were only getting reports about what's being spent by the Department of Social Development on relief and so on. And then last week, we raised the issue about we've got to have a broader discussion now. We've got to discuss the UBIG. And so I think it would be worth focusing it on that, and then linking it to the issue of stimulus package, so to make it, and it, obviously where the corruption thing has to then be dealt with and so on, as something which is an immediate, well, it's not exactly a low-hanging fruit, but it's something where there's an increasing level of consensus on the desirability of the concept.
Thanks, Pat. I think there is growing momentum on this. So we at CHI, we are taking this mandate. And so we will then make a plan to actually have this session. And I am glad that is Comrade Neil still here? Neil Coleman. I know that he has written, they have written quite a bit as well on this. And so hopefully we can put together some of these comrades who are dealing with this. But I think the guidance also, even the issues that have just been raised by Comrade Pat, are quite significant, maybe around how do we craft the kind of discussion so that it does not bog us down on polemics, but it actually is more helping us to actually give more direction and really how we can move forward in a way that can be able to build campaigns and that can build political programs that can really advance it forward. And so on that note, let me thank everyone that has been participating, and we have a promise that IEJ, they will send the full paper, and so we will follow up on that, and we can then be able to distribute to everyone that is here. And we thank you very much, comrades, for coming. And so we are hoping we will have another session next week. And so we hope to see many of you there as well. Thank you very much for participating. Can I ask that we continue in the conversation with Alex and Jenny after we finish?
Suitably hijacked.